Okay, slide 6. And we're still talking about Chapter 5, Intellectual Disabilities. So today the terms that you'll most often hear people using are mild or severe. What do these terms mean to you? Do you think that they help us understand someone better? Do they help us provide better services? Why or why not? In 1992, some of the traditional categories from mild, moderate to severe to profound, it was thought of, instead of having those descriptors, that we should talk about the amount of support that the student needs: limited, intermittent, extensive, and persuasive. And the DSM-5 has kind of been swinging this way. When we talk about, for example, the autism spectrum, they did away with Asperger's, but now we talk about the level of support a student needs. What are the strengths and weaknesses of describing the different categories? Because again, with an intellectual disability, there's a huge range. Those students with mild disabilities, a lot of the strategies we use with students with specific learning disabilities would be more similar. And those students with, whether you want to call it severe or you want to say that they need extensive support, they require very different strategies. So trying to have this broad range of definitions to describe students is something that we're always trying to do to communicate. So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different ways of communicating, and what do those terms mean to you? So identification of an intellectual disability in the early years. Again, oftentimes these students have very distinct features. They may not be achieving developmental milestones on target in terms of talking and walking. Now, some students do have physical components in conjunction and some don't have any of those. Students that are identified early often have genetic inheritance, a chromosomal abnormality, or some other prenatal cause. We typically refer, the first term that you'll often see with a student is that it'll be developmental delay, because differential diagnosis is really difficult with an 18-month-old. And so a developmental delay is kind of a global term, and then later we'll tease out as a profession, what is it that's really going on with this student? Okay, slide 8. So in the school years, initially students will have academic or behavioral challenges. Typically, if students aren't identified until the school years, they have mild intellectual delays. I have seen some exceptions to this. For example, certain religious groups that don't believe in medical care. I've done evaluations of much older students, and it's their initial evaluation because they weren't going to those wellness checks all along, so it didn't get caught. So there are some exceptions to that, but typically students, if it hasn't been caught up to this point, it means that it's a little more mild. We might use response to intervention first. We can use standardized IQ tests and adaptive scales because, again, they can participate in that process. And they must have both. Again, they must have both the cognitive delays and those adaptive skill deficits. So some major characteristics of students with intellectual disabilities, slide 9. Mild intellectual disabilities, we see delays in reading and math. Typically, this is just kind of a ballpark, up to the 4th, maybe 5th grade level, depending on where they're functioning. Must be given tools for daily living skills, but those tools, the level of support, they need more explicit instruction, but then they'll be able to get it. So they can eventually do those things themselves if they're taught explicitly how to do them. With moderate intellectual disabilities, again, the more significantly impacted the student, kind of the more variance we see about what they're able to do, may be able to learn up to a first or second grade level, must be given tools for daily living skills, and more supports for being able to enact those tools, can work in the community post-school, especially with support with severe intellectual disabilities. They might be able to recognize symbols or pictures. And the more severe, the more likely they'll experience other physical and mental conditions. So a lot of those students have quite a bit going on, and so their plan needs to be pretty comprehensive in terms of their support. Okay, what are the functional skills that you believe are most important for students with intellectual disabilities to learn, and why? Have you ever reflected on the kinds of academic skills necessary for day-to-day living? In the areas of academics, what do you think would be important for individuals with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities to learn? The real critical thing here is when we talk about working with students with intellectual disabilities, we have to really focus and prioritize. And we need to know exactly what skills and knowledge are going to give them the greatest life outcomes, that'll help them be as independent as possible. So we have to be very strategic, and we can't waste their time learning things that won't pay off for them in the long run. So there's a lot of planning that needs to take place, especially, what functional skills. Not all skills are created equal. And so what skills do these students really need to have the richest life possible? And those are the ones that we want to focus on. Language skills are typically restricted. Problems with articulation and grammar, receptive language difficulties. Sometimes when students are really young, going back to that early identification, they'll be found eligible under a communication disorder when they're 2 or 3 years old, and then it'll really come out later that it wasn't a communication disorder, but it was an intellectual disability. Some other things: observational and incidental learning. They often have deficits in this area, whereas other students might look to see what another student is doing and then copy that. And because of that, that goes back to that very planned and explicit instruction. What do we need them to know? How do we structure and sequence, breaking down the task? So if you think about how to unlock your front door, if that's what you want to teach somebody, you'll take every task and break it down. And you might do forward chaining or backward chaining. And backward chaining would be you start at the end of the task where you've already unlocked it and they push the door open. And then you teach them to turn the key and then push the door open, and then put the key in, turn it, and open the door. And so you'll go from the task being completed and backwards, and then forward chaining we'll do with students would be going forward, and that would be take the keys out of your pocket, put the key in the lock, turn the lock, push the door, close the door behind you. And so you would teach each one of those steps to mastery and then move on to the next step. Often deficits in skill synthesis, so you're going to help them synthesize those skills. If you teach 2 skills and you don't put it together for them in a practiced way, they might not put it together for themselves. And generalization. So learning something in one context and being able to apply it in another can be difficult. And so you'll want to give students a lot of practice at being able to apply skills in different settings. Many students with intellectual disabilities do not profit from observational or incidental learning. What strategies can teachers in inclusive classrooms use to assist these students to improve in this area? Major social characteristics of students with intellectual disabilities: social interactions. Restrictive cognitive and language development may hamper their social skills, so being able to interact with peers about the same topics that peers want to talk about. Difficulty with attention and memory can impact social interactions, and difficulty reading social cues. Again, that observational learning might be a deficit, and so you'll have to directly teach how to read social cues. Behavioral challenges. You can have some of those stereotypical behaviors, some self-injurious behaviors, which are always really difficult to manage, aggressive behaviors, non-compliant behavior, and there often can be significant behavioral challenges with students, especially students with more significant cognitive delays, and that will be a big part of the support plan for these students so that they're not a danger to other students, so they're not a danger to their siblings, and those types of things. Should general education teachers have the responsibility of facilitating positive social relationships between students with and without intellectual disabilities? Should this be a part of their responsibilities as a teacher? What is your opinion? Okay. Causes of behavior. There is a belief that all behavior is a form of communication. And so with that thought, sometimes students with intellectual disabilities adapt maladaptive behaviors because they found that they communicate or get them what they want. And so it's best determined to do a functional behavior assessment, which determines the function. Or another thought about the function is if you think that we maintain behaviors or keep repeating behaviors because we're getting something out of it, what is maintaining that behavior? What is the function of that behavior? What is the student getting out of that behavior? So is it adult attention? Is it getting out of tasks? Those types of things. And a behavior intervention plan may be developed for students with intellectual disabilities, and that's often the case. Many people believe that uncommon, sometimes challenging behaviors have a communicative intent. Do you agree with this belief? Why or why not? Describe strategies that teachers can use to determine the communicative intent of challenging behaviors. Okay. So teaching students with intellectual disabilities in inclusive classrooms, you'll want to get a good understanding of the individual's strengths and limitations. Work closely with colleagues. There's probably often occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, adaptive PE specialists, a lot of people that can help support you and that you'll be working with. Have confidence in yourself as a teacher. Get students without disabilities involved, and this can often be a huge benefit for all of the students. And celebrate the small gains and enjoy them. Again, one of the common characteristics is that learning growth will be a little smaller and take a little longer. So you want to celebrate that path and what they are learning. Students with intellectual disabilities can do a whole lot. They can learn a lot. If we provide the structure and we really make a concerted effort to teach them things and give them the repetitions that they need to master skills, they can get there and do amazing things. How important do you think it is for students with intellectual disabilities to participate in general curriculum as opposed to focusing on more functional academic skills? What are the pros and cons of these different curricular orientations? This is a really key question because it's one of the number one things that will come up in IEP meetings. How do we best serve our students? And how do we help them? Again, students with intellectual disabilities, by definition, will have adaptive skill deficits or those functional skill deficits. And so how do we make sure that they are getting the support they need to build those academic skills as well as to build those functional activities of daily life skills. So this will be a good concluding question to ponder.